words that simply say, you are an unceasing spiritual being with an eternal destiny in God's great universe.
One of the things I think that can stand in the way of coming to Christian belief and commitment is a view of God that makes God out to be unattractive, somehow off-putting, deeply unloving, or something like that. And if the view of God that you have has God made out that way, chances are no amount of arguments are going to convince you to fall in love with God or to give your life to God. So one of the things that we can do in apologetics is to address popular conceptions of God that might be off-putting or have God out to be unloving. Dallas, and I'll just say, I think more and more people who resist commitment to the Christian way are resisting not because they take themselves to have some decisive proof that Christianity is false, but because the God of Christianity that they've been introduced to is somehow deeply unattractive to them, or off-putting, or unloving. So one of the things we can do as apologists is to attempt to dislodge these ideas of God that keep people from falling in love with God. Dallas often did this with rhetorical questions. And so this talk today is a development of some ideas in the connection with one of these rhetorical questions that Dallas would often ask, and that shows up in his Allure of Gentleness books. So here's the question he would often ask in apologetics-y kinds of environments. Dallas would ask, do you think that God has to know everything whether or not God wants to? Do you think God has to know everything whether or not God wants to? So here then is a talk in the direction of that rhetorical. So Dallas Willard did not think that God knows everything. He didn't think that God knows everything. In the Allure of Gentleness, he puts the point this way, quote, God does not have to know anything he does not wish to know. His omniscience refers to his ability to know everything, just as his omnipotence refers to his ability to do anything that he wishes. And among the things that he chooses not to know are certain things about you and me, end quote. So there's an important similarity, I think, between Willard's view of God's knowledge and that of the mainstreams of so-called open theism. Both claim that God lacks exhaustive knowledge of the world. But Willard's view is, in a certain sense, more radical than the standard open theistic line. For most open theists, God doesn't know, for example, what free creatures will do in the future because there currently is no true proposition concerning that state of affairs for God to know. So it's consistent with the standard open theistic line that God knows everything that can in principle be known. Right? For Willard, though, there are true and knowable propositions that are nevertheless unknown by God. And this, for Willard, is a consequence of God's loving refusal to know them. So here's a reflection on Willard's suggestion that God's love for us motivates God's voluntary ignorance in some cases. Suppose then that God occasionally elects not to know things, and that God is motivated from love so to do. How so? How might love motivate voluntary refusals to know? Well, one way to approach this question is through an exploration of conditions under which we, the non-divine, are sometimes motivated by love to voluntarily refuse knowledge. We do this sometimes. Sometimes we elect not to know things out of a concern that the knowledge in question will make it more difficult to maintain loving attitudes, say of respect or sympathy toward the beloved. If, for example, I know that my friend struggles with some kind of especially shameful addiction, I may elect to leave unknown the particulars of this person's addictive behavior. I may even go so far as to interrupt his detailed confession to protect my state of unknowing with respect to the particulars. I may be motivated by love so to do if I recognize that I'm in danger of losing respect for or the ability to empathize with my friend were I to know the details. I think we can all imagine circumstances like that. Clearly enough, though, cases like these will not give us the resources we need for understanding the suggestion that God may elect to leave things unknown. We can hope, at least, that God does not share our incapacity to persist in respect and sympathy for others in the context of unfiltered acquaintance with their shortcomings. We can hope that God's better than that. While it might be right and good for me to protect my ignorance and my ability out of respect for my friend and love for my friend, we shouldn't expect God to have this particular motivation for persisting in states of unknowing. Maybe a more plausible analog can be found in those circumstances where we voluntarily persist in a condition of unknowing out of respect for the beloved's privacy and autonomy. Willard would sometimes point out in this connection that a good parent does not know everything it's in her power to know about her teenager. If the teenager has a diary hidden under the loose floorboard in her room, for example, and the parent discovers as much, she may elect to refrain from knowing the contents of the diary. Even if the parent has perfect confidence that she'll respect, love, and sympathize with her child, whatever the contents of the diary, she may elect to leave its contents unknown out of respect for the teenager's privacy. Maybe God is similarly concerned to respect our privacy. So this particular point turns on interesting questions, I think, about privacy. You might wonder, what's the good of it? What's the good of privacy? And perhaps more to the point, what exactly is wrong with violating it, with violating privacy? Maybe the good of privacy is a species of the good of ownership. We own things, and it's good that we do. And among the things we own are bits of information. Information about ourselves, about our relationships, about other things that we hold dear. Violations of privacy, then, you might think, are acts of theft. The mother who peeks at her teenager's diary wrongs the teenager by stealing from her those bits of information that rightly belong to the teenager, and the dissemination of which rightfully falls to the discretion of the teenager. The parent has no right to possess the information she's acquired. It's not hers to know. If it is at bottom a question of the right to possess information that underlies the parent's refusal to know the contents of the diary, again, though, it's less clear that God can be similarly motivated to leave some things unknown. As creator and sustainer of the universe, you might think, God has the right to know anything God wants to know. There are no bits of information owned by anyone else in such a way as to preclude their being in God's rightful possession. The question of theft, it seems, simply can't arise. So we're still without a non-divine analog for love's refusal to know things. Respect for privacy, though, is not wholly explained by intuitions about ownership of information. Quite apart from the question of theft, the parent may recognize that the flourishing of the child requires that the child not live in the uninterrupted gaze of her parents or anyone else. That she needs space free of the gaze of others to experiment with uninhibited self-expression in order properly to flourish and develop. Even were the child to request the uninterrupted gaze of the parent and thereby remove the possibility of theft, the wise parent would refuse. The wise parent would recognize the good of privacy for her child, quite apart from questions about theft and ownership. And it's not just children, I think. If an adult asks a friend to arrange things in such a way as to eliminate all their private space, say as a radical accountability measure or something like that, the wise other will decline. And this is because we recognize goods associated with privacy that have nothing to do with matters of ownership or rights and theft. So maybe God is motivated by love to protect the privacy of God's beloved, even if God, as creator and sustainer of the universe, has a perfect right to the possession of any information God should choose to know. Maybe God's refusal to know is grounded in God's recognition that we require some degree of privacy in order to flourish and develop into the free beings God created us to be. So there's one, now I suggest plausible suggestion about what motivates God's refusal to know on the Willardian picture. And now I turn to a second way, and apologies in advance, this part of the paper is a little sappy, and I know philosophers aren't supposed to get sappy, but there it is. So one final way that we, the non-divine, that for us, a state of unknowing can be in the service of love. Last summer, my wife and I celebrated 24 years of marriage. And in comparison with the way we know each other now, I think we were virtual strangers on the day we got married. In 24 years of mutual discovery, deep recesses of personality and character have slowly, over time, made their way into our collective consciousness. With increasing accuracy over the years, I found myself capable of predicting her thoughts, her reactions, her behaviors and feelings, and she mine. Our increasing knowledge of one another has allowed us to move more and more fully into an approximation of that beautiful ideal of being fully known and fully loved and accepted. But we're still learning, my wife and I. And I still occasionally experience the frustration characteristic of the learning process. In those moments, Laurel is a mystery to me. I can't find my way into her perspective. I can't predict or understand her reactions. I can't find any genuine sympathy for the way she's feeling. I'm reminded that we're still learning about each other. For all of my progress toward understanding, there's still much about Laurel that I don't know. I'm the learner, and I'm powerless to learn without her willingness to explore with me. If I'm going to continue to make progress in my discovery of this beautifully complex person with whom God gave to me to share a life, I'll need her cooperation. She'll need to lead the way. Suppose God appeared one day and plopped the knowledge button down on our dining room table. Suppose God told us that we could, if we both consented, push the button together, resulting in our having complete and exhaustive knowledge of one another. In an instant, we could know everything, past, present, and future, about each other that it's possible for another person to know. No more mystery. No more frustrating nights spent in tears trying without success to grasp the perspective of the other. No more failed predictions. No more disappointed expectations. I wouldn't push the button. So that's the idea here. I wouldn't push the button. Best I can tell, my refusal to push the button wouldn't be motivated primarily by a respect for privacy, hers or mine. Instead, my deep desire is to progress in our knowledge of one another so that on our 40th anniversary, it'll be tempting to say that we hardly knew each other at all on our 24th anniversary. That's the hope. For as long as we're together, I hope to make progress in the direction of full and exhaustive knowledge of one another. But I don't want to arrive. That's the paradoxical thing. I don't want to arrive. I rejoice with every step along in the direction of exhaustive knowledge. Each step has as a consequence that there's one less occasion for tearful impotence to achieve sympathy or to understand Laurel's perspective. It's a step in the direction of that unity of mind and spirit for which we strive, and it's wonderful. But I recoil at the thought of taking the final step. As much as I love knowing Laurel, I love something else just as much, and maybe even more. I love learning about her. And I love helping her to learn about me. I love the lifelong process of mutual discovery. I love finding out as much as I love knowing. Something of inestimable value would be lost to me were Laurel and I to find ourselves suddenly, or even not so suddenly, at the end of our lifelong journey of mutual discovery. Lost would be the joy of finding out, the periodic overcoming of frustrated attempts to know. The thought that we had for the very last time experienced that soul sigh of relief that comes with finally getting it after a long struggle to understand would be for me a deeply sad one. So I embrace my unknowing condition as a part of the essence of this deeply good journey that is my marriage to Laurel. I embrace it as an essential component of this unfolding thing that is our love together. And the embrace implies that there's a dimension of love that requires the possibility of discovery, that requires that knowledge be incomplete. Perhaps God delights in learning about God's beloved, in something like the way that I delight in learning about Laurel. If so, then God's love may be thought to motivate the preservation of states of unknowing directed upon God's beloved. If God does delight in learning about God's beloved, and if learning is inconsistent with exhaustive knowledge, then God's love can be thought to motivate God's resisting exhaustive knowledge of us, even if it's in God's power to achieve it. Okay, so now a few reflections on omniscience, or implications about omniscience. Does all of this imply that we should give up on divine omniscience? That's a tempting thing to say. But Dallas didn't say it. Dallas didn't give up on omniscience as a property of God. This view does imply, though, that we should understand omniscience not in terms of the number of true propositions known by God, but rather in terms of God's power to know whatever God wishes to know. It was Willard's view that this understanding of God's omniscience is better in keeping with the way we think of God's other great-making properties. We don't think of God's omnibenevolence in terms of the number of loving things that God does. Neither is his omnipotence conceived in terms of the number of things that God does. God's omnibenevolence and his omnipotence are conceived as dispositions or powers. God is perfectly lovingly disposed toward God's creation, and God can do anything power can do. And this is true of God regardless of the number of loving deeds God performs or the percentage of things it's in God's power to do that God does in fact do. Why shouldn't God's omniscience float similarly free from the number of things that God knows? Perhaps omniscience, like omnibenevolence and omnipotence, has less to do with the number of things God knows and more to do with the power that God has to know anything that can be known. In a fascinating essay called Divine Cognitive Power, Charles Tolliver considers but ultimately rejects a view of omniscience like the one under consideration. He rejects the view on Anselmian grounds. A being that fails to know knowable propositions seems, he suggests, less than maximally epistemically great. But what if we follow Willard's lead and allow love to be the dominant influence on our conception of the divine? What if we allow the conditions of love to inform our conception of epistemic greatness? If the argument of this paper succeeds, such an approach may yield a God who does not know everything that is in principle knowable. Perhaps this is but one expression of the unbounded freedom of God, so beautifully and provocatively captured by Karl Barth in the second volume of his Church Dogmatics. And I'll close with this longish quote from Barth, medium-ish length quote from Barth. God is free. Says Barth, God is free to be and operate in the created world, either as unconditioned or as conditioned. God is free to rule over the world in supreme majesty, and likewise to serve in the world as the humblest and meanest of servants, free even to be despised in the world and rejected by the world. God is free to be entirely unlimited, over against the world. He is equally free to limit himself, to be shut up in the totality of our time-space universe, but also in all humility to be confined to this or that time and place as contrasted with other times and places. This is how he meets us in Jesus Christ. His revelation in Jesus Christ embraces all these apparently so diverse and contradictory possibilities. They are all his possibilities. If we deny him any one of them, we are denying Jesus Christ and God himself. Instead of recognizing and adoring God, we're setting up an idol, for we are imposing upon him, in defiance of the freedom which he has actually proved to us, a bondage which can only be that of our own self-will that would like to deny God and put itself in the place of God.